Not all unhappiness comes from pain. Some of it comes from being taught to interpret an ordinary life as oppression. Now, that distinction sounds a little subtle at first, but it is actually one of the more consequential ideas buried inside modern political and cultural life, and it is worth taking seriously rather than dismissing as cynicism. Marxist theory has a name for the process by which this teaching happens. It's called consciousness raising. And the idea, stated plainly, is that the working class does not naturally arrive at revolutionary anger on its own. Left alone, people tend to want modest, practical improvements, better wages, better conditions, and then get on with their life. For a revolution to occur, someone from the outside has to arrive and teach us what our condition actually means. The oppression has to be explained to us before it can be felt as oppression at all. Now, this is a strange thing to admit openly, and yet it was admitted openly, which tells us something very important. Grievance, in this framework, is not simply discovered, but is installed. The mechanism behind that installation is fairly simple once it's laid out. Marxist theory divides the world into two groups, oppressor and the oppressed. And once that binary is in place, it becomes a lens through which every frustration can be reinterpreted. An ordinary limit, i.e., not having enough money for something that we might want, or a marriage that feels less exciting than it might have once did, or a job that is fine by all relative metrics, but is unremarkable. All of these things get reclassified as evidence of a structural injustice, rather than simply being a feature of being a finite person living a simple life. Now, this is not an accident of the framework, but instead its entire function. Consumer dissatisfaction becomes evidence of capitalist manipulation. Relationship dissatisfaction becomes evidence of patriarchal conditioning, and class resentment becomes evidence of systematic theft. In each case, the actual content of the frustration matters less than its usefulness in confirming the binary. Once we are taught to see the world this way, nearly anything can be sorted into the correct column, and the sorting itself starts to feel like insight rather than what it actually is, which is simply a story imposed onto existence from the outside. It would be a mistake, though, to conclude from all of this that unhappiness is manufactured, or that every grievance is nothing more than ideology wearing the costume of sincerity. Because real suffering and injustice do exist. People are sometimes genuinely underpaid, genuinely mistreated, and denied things that they might be owed. And naming those situations, honestly, is not the same thing as manufacturing grievance out of nothing. The distinction worth holding on to is much more precise than that. Ideology does not usually invent suffering from nothing. It instead tends to magnify it and simplify it and put use to it. A framework that sorts the entire world into oppressor and oppressed will always find material to work with, because life always contains some real friction, and the trick is never claiming that friction doesn't exist, but instead insisting that all friction means the same thing, and that it always points towards the same villain, and that the correct response is always anger. That is where a legitimate observation quickly becomes an ideological instrument, and it is worth staying alert to the difference rather than collapsing the two into one category. Set aside this framework, and it is worth returning to a much older and, I would argue, much wiser piece of political language. The Declaration of Independence names life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness as inalienable rights, and it is worth sitting with the precision of that third phrase, because it is doing something the Marxist framework refuses to do. It does not promise happiness. but simply protects the pursuit of it. Jefferson was drawing on an older philosophical tradition, one going back through John Locke, and further still to classical thought, concerned less with guaranteeing a particular emotional state and more with securing the conditions under which a person might reasonably go about seeking a good and well-ordered life. The Marxist framework implies a kind of entitlement to happiness, i.e., that happiness is owed to us, and any absence of happiness is proof that it is being stolen. The American framing offers something much more modest and more honest. It offers the freedom to pursue without pretending that the pursuit is guaranteed to succeed on any particular day or any particular marriage or even at any particular income level. This raises the obvious question of what happiness actually is. If it is not simply the accumulation of comfort or the satisfaction of every want as it arises. Aristotle is the most useful voice here because he made a distinction that most modern discourse has lost completely. He distinguished between fleeting pleasure and flourishing. On Aristotle's account, a person could be flourishing in the deepest sense while still experiencing things like loss and disappointment or difficulty, because flourishing was never defined as the absence of hardship. Instead, it was defined as living well in response to whatever hardship arrived. And this is almost the exact opposite of the modern assumption that any friction in life is evidence that something has gone wrong and someone else is to blame. Aristotle would have found that assumption to be incorrect, because for him, difficulty was simply part of the material a well life had to work with, not proof that the project of life or government or society has failed. When you put the two frameworks side by side, the contrast becomes very sharp. Marxist theory teaches people to interpret their lives through the lens of grievance, sorting experience into oppressor and oppressed until nearly everything confirms the sorting. The American tradition, drawing on a much older philosophical inheritance, invites people to pursue a well-ordered life without pretending that that pursuit can be guaranteed, or that its absence on any given day constitutes an injustice requiring a villain. One framework manufactures certainty about who is to blame for what, and the other offers freedom and asks us to do the harder, slower work of building a good life inside of it, without the guarantee of success, and without an assigned enemy to explain away the difficulty when it inevitably arrives. And this matters far beyond the specific history of Marxism, because the mechanism that it relies on is available to nearly anyone willing to use it, not just revolutionaries. A person, a movement, or an institution that benefits from our discontent has every incentive to teach us that our ordinary, adequate life is actually a wound that we simply haven't noticed yet. Once we are trained to interpret every limit as oppression, we become simultaneously easier to manipulate and harder than ever to satisfy, because the frame guarantees that that satisfaction will always be just out of reach, always deferred to the next grievance, the next comparison, and the next villain. A freer, more honest philosophy would be to teach the opposite skill, the ability to distinguish between genuine injustice, which deserves real attention and correction, from the ordinary limits and disappointments that come with simply being a finite person living inside of a finite life. Happiness was never something that reality or government or society owed to us. It was usually something worth pursuing anyway, built through habit and virtue, and was never handed over as a guarantee. And that is a much harder sell than a ready-made villain. And it also just so happens to be true. So, With that said, thank you guys so much for watching, and as always, don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe, and I'll see y'all next time.